I'm Dean Newland, and welcome to the Business of Intuition, where I coach, facilitate, train, and speak on the hard science and meaningful experience of intuitive leadership in business, so you can make better decisions, forge real connections, and creatively solve problems to amplify your impact and simplify your life. Welcome to the Business of Intuition.
If you were to ask a group of people to write down words that would define a good leader, you might hear things like bold, visionary, decisive, concise, organized, strategic. You might even hear words like empathetic, good listener, good coach, mentor, etc. However, I bet you would not see the word sensitive. Sensitive is not normally a word that we associate with strong leadership and strong entrepreneurship. In fact, it's been sort of relegated in our own lexicon of words to describe people as someone who is unable to cope. Hence the phrase, that person is just too sensitive. It's become almost a blemish on how we see people. However, my next guest on the Business of Intuition has not only used that word, but she is leaning into it and its meaning. She's done a lot of research and has found wonderful research around how there are certain people in our world that are born into this planet with a certain high level of sensitivity. And those are actual strengths, not something to be afraid of. And that can be leveraged into a very successful role as a leader and also as a role as an entrepreneur. And we had just a wonderful conversation unpacking this idea around sensitive leadership and sensitive entrepreneurship. And we asked ourselves, and we had questions that we answered around, can you be sensitive and strong at the same time? How can you successfully lead by being sensitive and intuitive? How do you separate fear from revealing intuitive wisdom? Are women more sensitive and intuitive than men? And if not, how do we all tap into the pool of intuition and sensitivity? What does the research tell us about sensitive people, and how can they be able to create successful businesses and become strong leaders? What role does purpose and intention play in the lives of sensitive, intuitive people? Well, her name is Heather Dominick, and we had just a phenomenal time on this interview. And she is a woman who is, I will quite frankly say, impressively successful and highly sensitive, a former high school drama teacher who collaborated with none other than Bette Midler. She graduated with a degree at NYU, where she received her first coaching training. And Heather is also a winner of the 2015 Best of Manhattan Coaching Award and creator of the 2014 Stevie Award-winning virtual event called A Course in Business Miracles 21-day discovery series that attracted close to 6,000 people from all over the world, including Iceland, Nigeria, Russia, Asia, South America, Australia, Europe, and even the US. She has appeared on Lifetime television and has been published in numerous books, including Stepping Stones to Success alongside none other than Deepak Chopra. An exceptional facilitator and teacher, Heather is known for creating a safe, sacred environment for true transformation, whether delivering training online or in person. Since 2010, Heather has taught thousands of highly sensitive entrepreneurs and leaders from around the globe on how to release lifelong limiting beliefs, overcome fears, and develop new leadership skills in order to excel in business and life by doing things differently to create more impact and more income. Heather Dominick on the Business of Intuition. So Heather, nice to meet you from New York City. What a great place in which to call home. I am fascinated by this idea around sensitivity and sensitive leadership. And normally, in sort of we could call it a dominated perspective from a male paradigm, that sensitivity is maybe looked upon as a weakness versus a strength, or male versus female, which I, of course, don't believe that's the case. But could you sort of describe for our people, our listeners, what are some of the characteristics of a sensitive leader or sensitive purpose, and what What sort of value does that bring to our business? Because I know you help businesses become quite successful. You have several workshops and trainings on that, and using sensitivity as sort of that backbone to help one become successful in their business. So unpack this idea around sensitivity and its benefits.
Absolutely. Happy to. So first, I think it's valuable just to start with the phrase of highly sensitive person, which is far from a phrase coined by me. It actually comes out of research from the mid-1990s. There's one psychologist and researcher who's most known because she has written the book, The Highly Sensitive Person. Her name is Dr. Elaine Aron. In short, what it means to be a highly sensitive person is that you are a person who is born into the world with a nervous system that responds more aggressively to stimulation than someone who's not highly sensitive. So that stimulation can be anything from like sight to sound to smell to touch to energy, emotion, information. And if you are a highly sensitive person and you are taking in stimulation at a much higher degree than someone who's not, you are going to have a different experience in the world than someone who's not highly sensitive. The work that I do is I take the research from Dr. Elaine Aron and other researchers around the highly sensitive person in the direction of what it means to be a highly sensitive person who is attracted to being self-employed, and how to really be able to use your sensitivity to work for you rather than against you within the complexity that is required to be successful as a person who's self-employed or as an entrepreneur. And that extends to overall leadership.
That's an interesting combination where you're pairing up a highly sensitive person who also has this desire for self-employment.
Yes.
Sometimes you hear that those two don't connect. That the highly sensitive person goes, I don't want to be self-employed. I want the security. I want things that are not dramatic. And being self-employed feels like I'm going to overstimulate myself. So give me some calm, please. Give me something that's secure. Right. So are you finding that is there a lot of people out there that have this combination of highly sensitive and wanting to be self-employed?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, everything that I've developed in terms of tools and teachings and trainings as part of the highly sensitive leadership training programs all comes from my personal experience. So I had been self-employed for about like 6 or 7 years and really just felt myself like just, coming up against just a massive wall in terms of everything that I was learning about how to be successful in business, and then the impact that I was experiencing physically in terms of just exhaustion and overall burnout. And it was that moment that led me to learn that I was a highly sensitive person. I had never even heard that phrase before. And once I started to understand more about what it actually meant to be a highly sensitive person, it was like all these light bulbs went off. And I was like, oh my gosh. So I actually need to go about being in business very, very differently. I need to go about marketing differently, selling differently, operations differently. And I started making those changes for myself, and then began to learn that the women that I was coaching at the time, one by one, discovering that each of them was highly sensitive. And then that really just uncorked this entire population of people, particularly service-based women, but also some men who feel a call to be able to offer a valuable service. They want to do the work, but everything that comes with what's needed to be able to do that work as a person who's highly sensitive either was keeping them from actually being able to do the work that they felt called to do, or is making it extremely challenging. And then that's where me and my experience comes in.
You mentioned women and you mentioned a few men in this conversation. So I'm probably going to ask you the question that you've been asked many a time. So here it is, the softball pitch over the plate. Are men not as sensitive than women? Okay. Are we, so what is is that a common, well, how am I trying to say this? Do all of us have those sensitive tendencies or skills or attributes? And can we all access the same pool?
Great question. And so appreciate the way that you phrased it. So basically, first and foremost, the unique strengths that are available to those of us who are highly sensitive are definitely available to people who are not highly sensitive as well. I just kind of like to think of it like on a scale or a spectrum, right? So somebody who's highly sensitive is going to have a higher access to those strengths than someone who's not highly sensitive. Then we go back to the base of the research, which is that being highly sensitive is how you're born into the world. So I always like to say, your parents didn't do it to you. You didn't pick it up on the playground in preschool, and it's not because of that weird purple drink that you had in college. Like, this is how you were born into the world, and that includes men. Then we need to look at society, and we need to look at culture. That's typically where the differentiation comes in, is that at this time, where we are in our global culture and our global societal norms, is that women have a bit more permission right now to be able to embrace, or even begin to accept their highly sensitive nature more than men do.
Yeah, and I would concur with that, being a man who grew up with that distinction. And I found that through creative writing and through theater and acting, I was able to access those pools of sensitivity, which one could say, and even coaching and all the work on listening and intuition, that hence the name of this particular podcast, I think has its cousin in this world of sensitivity. I can look at a painting and stand in front of it for 30 minutes and just sort of go somewhere with it. We are hedonists, my wife and I. We love good food. We love to travel. I think that's out of that sensitivity, at least from my perspective. So is there, what's the opposite of sensitivity then? If one is highly sensitive, is there an opposite that is also another domain that is in balance to that sensitivity, that actually with the two coming together create sort of sometimes we're sensitive and sometimes we're bold and maybe even aggressive, and something that might sound in its nomenclature unsensitive. I guess I'm wondering, how does your mind model work with that?
Right. Well, again, I typically like to just bring it back to the research. So if we go back to, again, the foundation of the research, being a highly sensitive person is that your nervous system takes in stimulation at a much higher degree than someone who's not highly sensitive. Where my work comes in is I've identified what I refer to as 12 top shadows of being a highly sensitive entrepreneur and 12 top strengths of being a highly sensitive entrepreneur. Where you operate within those shadows and those strengths really has to do with how intentional you are in regards to learning how to work with your nervous system so that it can work for you. Now, if you're what I like to refer to as untrained, you're mostly probably going to go towards the shadow side. And the shadow side is, you think of, again, the nervous system being overstimulated. Shadows such as like overwhelm and physiological overwhelm, not just a big long to-do list overwhelm, but physiological overwhelm will happen a lot for someone who's highly sensitive. Or shadows such as over-responsibility or overprotection. And these just become kind of habitual default behaviors. If you're trained as a highly sensitive, then you start to be able to access some of those top 12 strengths and really use those to your advantage. Some of those top 12 strengths are intuition is absolutely a top strength. Being empathetic is a top strength. Being a deep listener is a top strength. Some of what I've already heard you speaking to. So someone who's not highly sensitive, it's not that they're never going to get overwhelmed, and it's not that they're not intuitive, but most likely they're not going to experience either those shadows or those strengths at the level, at the height, to the degree of which someone who is highly sensitive. So I don't think that we can necessarily pit them against each other, right?
Right.
Like, this is a non-highly sensitive, and this is this type of person, and this is a highly sensitive, and this is this type of person. It's more of like, where are you in terms of your access ability to the way that the nervous system is interpreting the world around you?
So this is really interesting. I'm thinking about, there's so many, I'm making notes here, Heather, and when you look at me going down, I'm writing a note to remind myself of something, because I know we don't have, a day and a half to get through all this. But, for myself, I think that, and I'm bringing myself into this conversation to see where this goes and where others might connect to it. But I mentioned to you before we hit the record button that I have this interesting lifestyle where I like the opposites of things. On one hand, I spent a lot of time up in Bend, Oregon, which is if you were to say, a very sensitive place. It's a very intuitive place. There's natural reminders of nature all around us and ourselves, and the fresh air, and you can fill in the blanks of that. Then there's down in Phoenix, which is very hard and hot and pavement and flat and sun beating down on you and business, and it's the fastest growing metropolitan area in the country right now. I love them both, right? And I think that my own individual ecosystem is that I go back and forth between being very intuitive and very very sensitive, I should say. And then on the other side, I'm really a taskmaster. I'm a get her done kind of bird dogger, drive. And I find that I balance back and forth to that. Is that normal? Is that different? Is that common? Am I a freak?
I get that question a lot. What I really hear you speaking to, and again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I'm going to bring it back to the research, which is what I hear you speaking to is what Dr. Aaron refers to as high sensation seeking. And that as highly sensitives, we have this element of desiring a high sensation experience. And that varies to different degrees for each individual, right? Because whether you're a highly sensitive person or not, or even if you are a highly sensitive person, like all the highly sensitive people in the world, which by the way, there's only 20% of us, but all the highly sensitive people in the world, of course, are not clones of each other. But again, if you go back to the foundation, which is that the nervous system is taking in stimulation at a much higher degree, there are aspects for various highly sensitive individuals where there's part of you that kind of craves that high sensation. Yes. Not all the time, right? Yes. Along the lines of what you're describing, but at moments or degrees, and it is very positively stimulating. Now, once you learn more about yourself, which is, again, all the work that I do, then you can start to become intentional about where and when you are getting your stimulation and the ways that you're receiving stimulation. So again, it's working for you rather than against you. Now, someone who's untrained, highly sensitive, they might still crave and desire some of that high sensation, but because they're untrained and they're unconnected and unconscious, that could play out, say, in like dramatic relationship dynamics, right?
What about drug use?
Or absolutely along those lines, right? Okay. So myself, we were talking about this a little bit before we started the recording. I live in New York City. And once I learned that I was a highly sensitive person, it was kind of like, pieces to the puzzle fell into place. And I was like, oh, yeah, like I love a lot of the stimulation that I can get from living in a large city. But I've always created kind of like these cocoon, like sacred spaces within the city to live in that way so that I can flow back and forth between the two. And again, learning that I was highly sensitive, now that I can do that more intentionally versus, when I was younger and had first moved to the city and felt like a ping pong and didn't know how to really, again, manage so that it was really working for me and not sometimes, against me.
Where does willpower fit into this model?
Mm-hmm.
Is it part of our sensitivity? The reason why I'm asking this is really, so my mother is on the verge of passing. I've been seeing her over the last few weeks. She lives in Minneapolis, since I've been flying there, and she's definitely getting to that point where I could see that we're at that last chapter of her life, right? And I'm very blessed to have had a wonderful relationship and even a friendship with her. And so this last time I was there, I could feel her willpower come back and her desire to be in this world. Like her sensitivity, if you were to use your words, of what was sort of going on in her world, in her life, in her body, because she's riddled with cancer right now and she's on morphine and, she's going through hospice and all that. There's a part of me that could see this, like, boom, this old Capricorn come back to life and start wanting to control things. And this hospice worker later sent this email and said that the research that they have, they almost characterized this willpower characteristic in some of these patients as a separate organ. It's like you might be dying of cancer with your liver, your lungs, and pancreas and so forth, but this other willpower organ almost overtakes it at times. It prolongs life. And so I thought, like, how fascinating. My mother is full of willpower. I mean, that's been part of her DNA, as well as she's a very sensitive person based on my assessment of her. So where does willpower fall into this, I don't know, this matrix, if you will, of your world around sensitivity? Is it part of sensitivity or is it different?
What a beautiful question. Definitely, just feeling for this tender time for you. It's such a great question because I think it comes down to the essence of what makes us human. From, my spiritual practice with A Course in Miracles, which speaks to the power of divine free will. And that's what makes us human versus, other animal life, which is more instinctual. So when it comes to high sensitivity, we first and foremost, all as humans, share that power of will. Then I think it's about nature versus nurture. And are you supporting yourself, or have you been supported by others to access that will and use it in support of life force and who you've been brought here to be as a person? One of our strengths as highly sensitive people, as highly sensitive entrepreneurs and leaders, is that we do tend to be spiritual by nature because of that additional strength of being deep feelers. We also have the being deep thinkers. We also have the strength of being deep listeners. I would surmise that would then perhaps give us a bit more of that, going back to the word intentional, access to divine free will, to that willpower, should an individual choose, right? Because that's what will is. It's a choice.
So willpower, good. Willpower and intentionality are really very much the same thing. It's where you point it. You could point your willpower towards a sensitive perspective. You could point it wherever. It's the decision of the person where you want to point that.
That's right. And I think it's very much connected to leadership, right?
So let's talk.
Yeah.
But talk about it from that standpoint. Go back to you. I'm going to follow that last thing you said when it comes to leadership. I'm a leader. I'm a manager at a company. I've got 15 people under me. I'm hearing you say this. It sounds intuitively correct. What do I do? I know that I want to lead in a more sensitive way. It's just not working for me the way I've been leading in the past. What sort of things might you say to that person?
So first of all, when I speak to highly sensitive leadership, I always like to emphasize that it's not leadership only in the more traditional sense, or sometimes I like to refer to as like old century, right? Like previous past century sense of leadership. You have to forgive me because the original creators and authors of what I'm about to speak to, the names are escaping me, but there's the 4 quadrants of leadership, which is like power over, which is the more traditional leadership, power with, power within, and power to. So as a highly sensitive, we tend to more naturally live within the 3 opposing quadrants to the power over, to be able to use strengths such as, again, intuition, empathy, keep thinking, keep listening, etc., to be able to have power with, to motivate a group of people so that that group is operating from their individual strengths in service to a primary shared mission. For example, there's also power within, and that is the power within yourself. And to be able to lead oneself in the way that you show up, whether it's in a more traditional leadership position or just showing up as a person, as a spouse, as a partner, as a parent, as a citizen. And so for those of us who are highly sensitive, we do bring those unique strengths to access those 3 quadrants, which could be a very, very valuable service. And in my opinion, where we're at in the world right now, we're on this precipice, right, of tilting between the old and entering into the new. And there's lots of ways that we're being shown that the old way of leadership in many arenas is no longer working. And as highly sensitives, again, we have these unique strengths that we can bring forward into the potential for a new way, a way of betterment. Whether that's, again, you operating as leader of self, you operating as leader of business, you operating as leader of team, you operating as leader of family, et cetera, and et cetera.
Why is it shifting? You mentioned the old century may no longer be working. We're moving more towards a sensitive behavior paradigm. What's causing this shift?
Well, I'm going to reference Daniel Pink.
Okay.
He was,
like that.
I think, was like ahead of the curve with his book, A Whole New Mind.
Yeah.
Kind of forgetting exactly when that came out. That's like at least a decade old or
Sure.
around that time frame. And, in his book, he speaks to how we're moving into this more empathic age of leadership, and that a lot of the more tactile and, ways of operating have kind of run their course, right? They're being outdated, whether it's, the digital age that is eliminating, more tactile jobs, or, use of computers, but just as human beings. And again, I'm going with Daniel Pink.
Yeah.
Speaking here from what I've read and just my own personal experience. I don't have the answer to the universe in this question.
Yeah.
But, like we evolve, right? That's what human beings are about. That's what Daniel Pink's, work is all about. It's like we're always looking to be able to create. That's just who we are naturally as people, as human beings. And we're moving beyond everything that, the last century provided us with. And we're opening up into a bigger, broader space.
I don't know who said it, but I read somewhere that this shift on one slice of the pie or the cake or whatever had to do with the advent of computers coming into businesses back in the 60s. And we were shifting more to a knowledge economy. Now it's more of a creative economy. because of the fact that technology was doing some of the other things that we no longer need to do. And I could see that. And I don't know whether it's more of an academic, let's think about it. Isn't that interesting? But that doesn't change the fact that we all sort of sense that there is a shift going on. I think COVID moved us forward even more with respect to sequestering us to our homes and to our Zoom cameras. There's a gal I talked to just a couple of days ago was talking about human design and how the shifting of the planet is changing on that level of going away from sort of the mega companies that are trying to change, the entire, the world, to our leadership is now more focused on a localized level and the individual purpose versus the collective purpose. So, all of it's sort of interesting, academically fun to sort of consider all that. But I think it still comes back down to is, yes, there's a shift going on and we all feel it,
Yeah, we all feel
one way or the other, right? And so,
you can, watch the news or,
yeah.
Exactly. And you're going to see it. Right. So, again, can we answer the full reason to why right here in this podcast episode? I'm not so sure. But, again, you can just kind of look out your window and you can see it as well as feel it for sure.
All right. So tell us a couple of things about, well, first of all, you mentioned intuition as being one of your parts of your pillar or parts of your process. And I think you had mentioned that fear and intuition, you had a relationship between those two. Is fear the opposite of intuition? Is that on the other side of the coin? Is there value for fear, or is fear just sort of like the water that blots out the fire of intuition?
Yeah, such a great question. I actually write about this in my book because I would say, in my over a decade of doing this work, particularly for highly sensitive entrepreneurs, I get that question so much. How do I know if this is my intuition, or how do I know if this is my fear? And so in my book, I talk about the actual definitions of intuition, which speak to a sense of knowing. That intuition is connected to knowledge. And what's so fascinating to me about that is that question of how do I know if it's intuition versus fear, is that fear is a feeling, right? So again, not that we can necessarily answer this fully on this podcast, but from my practical research perspective is what seems to tend to happen is that, from research, particularly that comes out of the Heart Math Institute, our intuition connected to our heart brain, right? So heart brain versus head brain. And that the heart brain is actually 3 to 4 seconds ahead of the head brain. And so it's that intuitive sense of what's going to happen or where one needs to go or an action that one needs to take before the actual head brain has registered intellectually or logically, all connected to the nervous system, right? Of course. And so then fear is often a response to what the heart brain is intuiting, because the logic will come in. There'll be a limbic shutdown, right? Yes. The amygdala as an attempt to protect, and particularly to protect from the unknown, right? Because the heart is going to lead you, your intuition is going to lead you forward into expansion, into things that you necessarily haven't experienced before. So it's not necessarily an intuition versus fear. It's intuition quickly followed by fear.
Sorry, brilliant way of describing that. I haven't heard anybody clarify it in such a succinct way. Fear's a downstream effect. It's a reaction to the intuitive knowing that you might have.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and I appreciate that acknowledgement. And, part of the reason is because this is work that I've been doing for so long, including, for the community, the Business Miracles community, the highly sensitive entrepreneurs and leaders in the community. I lead what I refer to as intuitive planning days every 4 months, teaching how to actually use your intuition to plan. So I've just done a lot of work to really, break it down. So it's not just conceptual, but it's actually practical. And then, there to serve and support you. Yeah, to be able to really operate from your intuition, not as a sidebar, by the way, but really a strong intentional leadership skill.
That's great. So what sort of questions would you ask a person who is collapsing the fear with their intuitive knowing and can't see the intuition because what is before them is the fear? Because I can think of many times in my life when I had intuitive knowing and then quick, I got into fear. And then that's what I then chose to decide to do from then on was the fear versus the intuitive knowing, which was completely in a different direction. So how do you dislodge, unconnect the sinew between the fear and the intuition so we can see the intuition all by itself without the static of the fear?
First and foremost, it's commitment to a practice and a process of that untangling. And there's no way that just talking about it and even having an understanding of the need to disentangle will be enough. So when I talk about the highly sensitive leadership training programs, and I talk about a highly sensitive who's untrained versus a highly sensitive who's trained, part of that training, a core base to the leadership training programs, is that process of that untangling. So in foundational orientation trainings, where we orient you to yourself as a person who's highly sensitive, we teach tools that I refer to as energy management that are designed to do exactly what you're describing, to start to untangle all of the ways that there has become kind of like a mismatch of nerves as part of the nervous system, so that you're able to more proactively respond, right? Versus just habitually react. And that's what you're describing when you're describing you have the intuitive sense and then the fear comes in. So it's the same way you could think of it like an Olympian, right? Who trains for the race. You have to run that course over and over and over again, strengthening the muscles so that, when you hit the track at the Olympics, the body is ready. And using your intuition, using your heart brain is also a muscle that needs to be trained. So you enter into practice and you enter into process so that when those moments come, and especially leadership moments, right? Again, as an entrepreneur or leadership in, any other type of aspect, it's going to be a high pressure. It's going to need to most likely be quick. And an untrained, highly sensitive is going to close in, contract, pull back. That's an automatic, just shadow, untrained response. I have to protect myself. When you've been in training, then when those leadership moments come, you're able to access your intuition and you're able to operate from that space in the midst of pressure, in the midst of intensity, in the midst of needing to do something like make a quick decision.
Fear, to me, at times feels like avoidance, a shroud, a protection for what it is that I don't want to know, that I probably know. And I also think that the knowing part, the intuitive side, that sometimes later gets followed by the reaction, the fear. Once we sort of bifurcate and separate those two out, and I can get back to the knowing, the intuition, The next question is, now what? Do I have the courage to do something with it? Or do I even have the courage to stay with that truth and just not even do anything, just live with the truth of what that intuition says? And so I'm wondering if that characteristic of the ability to know the truth of which intuition is the guiding you to also shows up with the people who are highly sensitive and want to be entrepreneurs. Is there a connection there? Meaning, like, I was starting off by saying, you're kind of putting two different types of characteristics together, the highly sensitive and the people who want to be entrepreneurs. Like, sometimes you just think that doesn't match, because one would assume a lot of people might not want to be entrepreneurs because they are so sensitive and the risk involved in that. Right. But is that courage to know the truth that separates out the fear avoidance with the intuitive knowing? Is that's part of what the characteristics are of the entrepreneur who's willing to, move forward?
Yeah, so beautifully said. I haven't necessarily really put it together in that way. I would say, yes, absolutely. The way that I usually speak to it, and this, again, comes from my personal experience, as well as just hundreds and hundreds that I've mentored now over the years, is that the call to be of service to other people through the use of your personal gifts feels bigger than the individual desire to remain comfortable. And that's what offsets that juxtaposition. And I've been self-employed for 20 years, and I still have this internal battle all the time, right? It's like today I don't do.
Yeah, but you bring in a concept that I think is really important though, Heather, is that, and I'm going to use the word that I sometimes use, is that it sort of takes you out of the equation in a way, but it's no longer about you. Then it's easier to follow that intuition, or at least bifurcate it from the fear. Like, really, what I see when my intention, and I can't say that I always make this happen, but with coaching and with facilitating teams, is that I am not the source. Mm-hmm. I am only a conduit. Now, yes, there is a part of me that is part of this primordial soup of creativity and all the stuff that might go into that, but I'm not the source of this. I am just a messenger. And so when I can maybe it's just my own mental hack that I could tell myself, so I can say, I'm still responsible. I still have a culpability for the message. I'm still culpable for how things go. But in some ways, I can say it's not really me. I'm just sort of a conduit. I'm letting it flow, and it goes to the people with whom it is going. And people will ask me, well, how did your facilitation go? And I go, did they love it? Did you get high scores? And I go, well, that's not what's most important. That's not how I judge it. Yes, maybe they did. But what I'm judging is, did I get out of the way? Was I in the moment? Was I in flow? Was I able to be this conduit? Was I able to pivot based on the energy of the time and the day and the people and what was going on? That's what, to me, is accelerating and fun and purpose-centered for me.
Well, I think you just used a very key phrase there, purpose-centered, right? So for highly sensitive entrepreneurs, one of the things that I often speak to is that, unlike someone who is not highly sensitive as an entrepreneur, it's often money that drives the entrepreneurial venture. For highly sensitive entrepreneur, it's typically service that drives the entrepreneurial venture. Then the work that I do, where I come in, is how to be of service in your business and be well compensated, to not let that piece fall to the wayside, which is often what happens, again, for an untrained, highly sensitive. It's, they know that they can help other people, but then how to manage all the operations and the worth that goes with receiving the money and et cetera. So the magic place that I hear you speaking to is when you can enter into that purpose-driven space. You can be that conduit, and you also have the systems set up that are going to allow you to receive for being that conduit so that you can take care and you can continue to show up and be that conduit. And that's that, real key inner and outer combination that is so much of the leadership training programs. And often for it highly sensitive, it's like once they drop all of the pressure that tends to come from a lot of other business trainings and coaching approaches to business, which is like you have to like have a certain income in order to say that the work that you're doing is valuable. They can kind of drop that and they can get clear of like, well, wait, what is that compensation level that's actually good enough for me? Mm-hmm. And then it's the lowering of the pressure. And there can be, again, that kind of beautiful, just kind of vortex space of, oh, I can be of service and I can be well taken.
Yeah. And I think it's the other, the compensation is the other side of the service. It's like, it's hard for me to, other than maybe make hand gestures, which nobody can see, but it's about, you can't accept, how can you give?
That's right.
Stupidly simple concept, but it's a part of being able to provide as well as receive. Then the combination of both makes both even stronger. Heather, I could talk to you all day. I guess I'm going to come to New York and we'll go out for coffee sometime. I really would love to be back in New York. I have my wife and I go to these wonderful cities like London and Paris and, all these other places. And I think like, wait a minute, we got to go to New York. We haven't been to our own great city. We've been to others.
Please.
Ever done that. Got to do that. Right. So I will. So tell people how to connect with you, your work, your workshops. I know you've got, and I just took it, your free assessment on your website. Give us a little bit of lowdown on that.
Absolutely. So it's all located at www.businessmiracles.com. So you'll find the quiz that you just spoke to, which will help you to understand if you're super, or if you're like me, you're a super uber, highly sensitive entrepreneur, a success guide that you can work with, and other resources that you'll find there, including my podcast as well, all at businessmiracles.com.
Been a delight to meet you.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
You bet.
Thank you for listening to The Business of Intuition. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to learn more about Dean or Mission Facilitators Leadership, go to mfileadership.com. That's mfileadership.com.